Iran is home to the most enduring state challenge to the U.S. order in the Middle East today. And ironically, it has the most pro-American and even the most pro-Israeli population in the modern Middle East today. Flipping the script on the Ayatollahs, getting rid of the IRGC, that's not missionary work. That is National Security Strategy 101. It's great to see you, Pamela. Thanks for having me on. My name is Behnam Ben Taleblu. I'm the Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the think tank that focuses on national security and foreign policy in Washington, D.C. I've been in D.C. about 18, 19 years, and with FDD for about 13 of them, basically covering the breadth and depth of the Iran challenge. I'm a first-generation Iranian American, a native Persian speaker, and you could say this job is both an affair of the head and of the heart.
There's a lot of talk about whether this war was necessary, whether it was something that Trump did sort of impulsively or for ulterior motives. Is this a war of choice?
I think it's easy to impugn the president when it comes to impulses, but certainly this is a war of choice, but a war of the Islamic Republic of Iran's choice. America in 1979, shortly after the revolution happened in Iran, ousting a pro-Western king, did not cut diplomatic relations, nor did it upend its embassy overnight and begin this massive sanctions campaign that exists in the Iranian narrative. In fact, it stayed, which is exactly why you fast forward to November 4, 1979, American diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. That was the main crisis, an act of hostage diplomacy and international hostage taking, and that the Islamic Republic has only escalated over the past 46, 47 years. And in those ensuing 46, 47 years, there's been terrorist attacks and using proxy groups and cutouts against Americans and American partners, killing U.S. service persons across the Middle East, taking diplomats hostage, taking foreign nationals hostage, commencing a drone program, a ballistic missile program, a nuclear program, building a transnational terrorist enterprise. Today, Iranian proxies are on 4 continents. Today, Iranian drones are on 4 continents. Much is changing due to the threat posed by the Islamic Republic. And if you fast forward to how those threats impacted the U.S. and impacted Trump term 2, Iran, by the time the second Trump administration came in, was already in a cycle of violence that it and its proxies had started, where the proximate trigger for that was the post-October 7th Middle East. For the first time, Iran and its proxies really began to lose and lose meaningfully, mostly to Israel, but as well as to the United States of America. And when you look at the way the regime, even as it was losing, was still intent on fighting, was still intent on rebuilding. For example, after the 12-day war, after President Trump took out the Islamic Republic's uranium enrichment facilities and got what at least 4 different presidents had been trying to get in recent U.S. history, which was a cessation of the enrichment of uranium inside Iran. President Trump was the only one who got that in the past 3 or 4 presidencies. Iran's response was to have its clerical establishment issue fatwas against his life, against his property, and even against the female members of his family. So this is a regime that even as it's down, is continuing to fight. Certainly, it has spent these past 4 decades carrying out and putting money and blood and treasure and reputation behind the slogans that it has been chanting, like death to America, like death to Israel. And very much like revolutionary Islamist protege Sinwar, Khamenei went down fighting. Khamenei, Iran's former supreme leader, went down fighting, refusing even to budge or even to make a compromise like his predecessor earlier in the Islamic Republic did. So there is a litany of terrorist attacks, hostage taking, illicit procurements, missile development, sanctions busting, threats to Americans and American citizens and American service persons and American interests that unfortunately brought us here. And as Donald Trump has shown, contrary to previous other U.S. presidents, he will actually gamble. He will push the envelope. He left the Iran nuclear deal. World War III didn't start. He was willing to kill Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist, in 2020. World War III didn't start. He was willing to move the embassy to Jerusalem. World War III didn't start. He was willing to take some political risks that previous other administrations simply were not. And he was willing to pull the trigger against Iran's nuclear program, willing to take out its sole state partner in South America. And I think that cascade of successes, which, yes, there was admittedly risks behind each one of them, had brought the president to this current juncture where he was willing to cross that line. Make no mistake, the forces that brought the country to that juncture, that brought America to that juncture, was 4.5 decades of hostility and enmity and destabilization brought to you by the ideologues that still rule Tehran.
Can you say more about the history? Obviously, people are more familiar now than they were 10 years ago with the history, but what was the trajectory that brought the first Ayatollah to power?
Sure. So the first Ayatollah, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, you could call him the founding father or the pioneer of the Islamic Republic. And he is someone who, if you trace many of these kind of quote unquote anti-colonial movements in the third world during the Cold War at this time, cut their teeth on the anti-imperialism issue, cut their teeth on even anti-Zionism, cut their teeth on all of the kind of the toxic hotbed of ideologies that existed in the third world, but framed those ideologies through a very kind of unique domestic discourse. He was a cleric. He studied in the holy city of Qom. He was already in that city quite the outcast. He actually liked philosophy and mystical poetry more than jurisprudence. And very interestingly, the system that he pioneered later on in life, the guardianship of the jurisprudent, is basically if you take Plato's philosopher king, the Quran, and Karl Marx, and a whole host of innovations to somehow square peg round hole them together and create a highly authoritarian Islamist system that is grafted onto some Republican institutions. That basically describes the very Byzantine structure of power. And, he was a minority kind of figure among clerics because of his, very non-mainstream political and even theological positions. He really only gained prominence in Iran in the 60s, you could say, when a very famous cleric who was the, Grand Ayatollah or the Marja, the source of emulation for many Shiites in the region, had passed away. He sensed the vacuum, he filled it, and he tried very hard to become quite political quite fast, cutting his teeth on a lot of the Shah's social reforms, allowing women the right to vote, land nationalization, the agricultural reforms that were supported by the US and Iran in the 1960s, the presence of increasing American business people, and more importantly, military service people in Iran. And so he cut his teeth on those issues. I wouldn't say sometimes it's treated as a nationalist critique. I would say it's really more of an anti-imperial, anti-American, and anti-colonial critique that he fused with this hotbed of growing Marxism, populism, revolutionary ideology, such that when many disparate and dissonant Iranian forces were coming together to oppose the Shah, they were, communists and nationalists, liberals and Islamists. They didn't have much in common, but they were willing to create a Venn diagram where the least common denominator of being anti-Shah and anti-American was there. And Khomeini was really able to ride that and ride the wave of these forces to be able to come back from political exile, first in Iraq, then in Iraq, then in France, and then ultimately coming back to Iran on February 1st, 1979, and being able really through a combination of political cunning as well as quite a bit of deceit to hold this very vast coalition together. And the decade that he is in power from 1979 to 1989 is almost coterminous with the longest conventional war of the 20th century, which is the Iran-Iraq War. And he uses the backdrop of that war to securitize the state and to purge that very broad coalition, such that by the time you get to the end of the 80s, the end of the Iran-Iraq War, and near the end of his life, there's really only a host or a shade of Islamists. The liberals, the nationalists, the Marxists, the communists, the leftists are really all purged or have to reinvent themselves as some kind of a brand of Islamist. So he is somebody who comes from that milieu, and he puts the country via the regime that he created, the Islamic Republic, on this anti-American, anti-Israeli trajectory that has led to the sacrificing of the public good and the national interest for decades now, just so that ideology can be pursued.
What did the leftists, the communists, the socialists, the young people who were not particularly Islamist or religious, what did they think was going to happen?
Unfortunately, I don't want to say naivete, but the naivete was not just limited to those forces in Iran who had not been reading his works. Some of his works were banned, but also extended to academics and analysts and Iran watchers and policymakers abroad. Unfortunately, I think it was a Princeton professor, I don't want to impute an Ivy League yet again, who said that Khomeini would be like a Gandhi-like figure. There were many reporters who went to Paris or the suburbs of Paris where Khomeini was in exile in the late 70s and saw, some kind of older religious figure and assumed that he would merely retreat back to the seminary and hand over the country to the quote unquote political class. Even many closer to his ideology, some hybrid nationalist Islamists also believed that. They didn't believe that man in his late 70s, early 80s would have the iron will to kill. And consistently, be willing to kill and pit factions against each other as he did, or really build a coalition and shepherd it in the way that he did. But ultimately, that is what he did. And within Iran, again, the willingness of so many of those disparate social forces to downplay the difference and to upplay that limited part of the Venn diagram, to be anti-monarchy and to be anti-American, allowed them to, magnify the similarity and downplay the difference, such that whenever they did realize the difference, it was too little, too late.
What did he do to the factions that helped bring him to power but were not aligned with his religious view?
Religious view and also political view. Khomeini wasn't, was fond of using a whole host of crises, whether it was the hostage crisis, to securitize the space or anything else. Even the interim prime minister, who again was in jail during the monarchy period on and off, resigned after the hostage taking. And he said this line, which actually sort of a few lines that sounds better in English than in Persian, because there's a debate over when he first said it. But it is, he said, "I'm a knife without a blade." He's an interim prime minister. He has this kind of symbolic authority, but there's some real dark other nefarious forces. And that was in 1979. And that was the kind of structure that he was creating, a kind of a more at that time. Now it's much more institutionalist, but at that time, very personalist kind of system revolving around him, revolving around his ideology, which later his successor, Khamenei, would take and institutionalize to build up this national security state. But the people around him, again, felt the wrath, whether that was jail, permanent house arrest, exile, torture, and killing. And really, when you mentioned the leftists early on, the purging of Iran's prisons, per a fatwa from Khomeini, is really a product of how easily someone like this, who had such deep-seated convictions, was willing and able to shed blood or to give the order to shed blood.
When you say purging of the prisons, what happened?
Well, it's popularly called, it's famously called the Death Commission. And even Iran's former president, the one who passed away in 2024 in some helicopter accidents, Ibrahim Raisi, was on this 4-person death commission where they were merely, almost Soviet bureaucratic style, implementing the fatwa, going through the roles of the prisoners to see if they were religious or not. And because the vast majority of them were leftists, they wouldn't pray, or they were atheists, they basically, by admitting that they weren't praying or didn't believe in God or didn't believe in Khomeini's particular interpretation, that they had been sealing their fate. And a few years ago, the leaked audio of even the deliberations of that death commission came out. And when you looked at it, when you read the text later, and then even when you heard some of the audio, even some of the other clerics were trying to justify, were trying to come up with it's because this, they were trying to come up with some theological elasticity for the killing. But that younger cleric, who was only 29 when he sat on that death commission and later became president in 2021 and passed away in 2024, he, very much like a Soviet bureaucrat, just said, "Nope, they said they aren't doing it, so they will be killed." And that's what they meant by the purging. Is this constant hotbed of revolutionary activity, this slicing abroad, this slicing at home, this keeping the state in this constant security mode, has allowed them to really, unfortunately, keep control because they're willing to kill early and often.
In the early days, when people started to see what this revolution had wrought, were there attempts to overthrow this, the Islamic Republic and bring something more democratic into being?
As long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there's been opposition to the Islamic Republic. One of the most famous and earliest protests against Khomeini and this cabal that he had brought in were women themselves. We're on International Women's Day, just the same year as the return of Khomeini to Iran. There were mass protests against the hijab. So these phenomenon that we see now in the West, in the news, protests in Iran, women's rights activity in Iran, that stuff is as fundamental and early to the fault lines in Iranian society back then in 1979, 1980, as it is fast forward 4 decades later. The same, of course, for the potential fear of the military, which is one reason why this regime has such an entrenched national security state, is that Khomeini used to say the Artesh, which is the name of the national military, the Artesh has the Shah in its blood. And the way he got around that was, yes, he took over the state, so he took the national military with him, and they killed many officers, they purged many officers, They cut contracts with the Americans and all of that, but they created a parallel ideological military to check that institution. And that parallel ideological military had its roots in the localized bands of brigands who established revolutionary order in the heyday of the collapse of the previous regime. Basically, guys with guns beholden to local clerics, where that synergy between local guy with gun, local cleric, basically became the foundation or the pillars of power for the state. And you take those two pillars, clergy and brigandry, and you apply it to this conflict, the Iran-Iraq War. It becomes like that famous academic Charles Tilly's maxim: the more the state made war, the more the war made the state. And that cemented this national security state, led to the preferential treatment of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's this parallel ideological military over the national military, such that all of the big national security threats that we face today comes from the IRGC. And the reason that mattered for the heart of your question is because there was an even attempt at a coup. It was called the Noje coup. I think it was in 1980, an attempt from an air base in Iran's west to fly up and bomb Khomeini's house in Tehran. It was revealed, or it was intercepted or detected the night before, and they again killed a whole host of those officers as well. So the experience of coming into power with street protests, but also still meeting street protests, the experience of being wary of the national military and then detecting a coup potentially coming from the national military, and then ultimately the way they've governed led them to realize early on that they're unpopular, which again led them to double down on security, hard power to stay afloat at home. And we've seen how crass that can be when you fast forward to 2026. There are death counts in Iran based on those protests that are not just unprecedented for 47 years of the Islamic Republic, but unprecedented for the past 200 years of admittedly very turbulent contemporary Iranian history.
The earlier protests, for example, the Woman Life Freedom protest, how far did they get?
Well, the ones that most recently shook Iran in 2026, that started in late December 2025, really triggered by the super high exchange rate at that time, 1.43 million rials to a single US dollar. It started actually in the Tehran Bazaar, which is this gigantic, sprawling urban market and center of shops that has multiple zip codes. It's the largest bazaar actually in the Middle East. It was a key social and economic force that paved the pathway for the 1979 revolution. So when they flip, you really know you've lost your social and economic base. And they started, and soon there was a contagion effect of protests. It certainly wasn't the first one, but just to go backwards in terms of the chronology to help situate the viewers and the listeners, like I said, as long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there's been protests against them. The traditional pattern has been people come out for a political protest when there's a motivating political issue. And they seem to tie that to a certain faction of the state. 1999, the closure of a reformist newspaper, the storming of Tehran University by, security forces, paramilitary. As there's protests, they also at nighttime raid one of the dormitories. And that's one of the most violently repressed protests. Then 2009, the Green Movement, the stealing of an election, also away from a reformist candidate, back to everybody's famous and favorite Holocaust denier-in-chief, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, again, leads to mass protests, mostly in Tehran, but a couple other cities as well. These were times when the society, despite all the shortcomings of the state, was still willing to engage with the state. Again, it was a motivating factor, support one element, quote unquote, the least bad element, or the element furthest away from the supreme leadership, or furthest away from the most hardline elements of the state. But soon, Iranians in the country who had given this wide berth to the system realized that there is really no way to reform this system by, with, and through. You have to go against it altogether. There is no way you can get representative government in a system that orchestrates and engineers anything but popular accountability and representation. So in the decade between 2009 and 2017, there's a whole host of overpromises and underdeliveries. There's a whole host of state erasure. There's a whole host of labor protests that really go unreported, such that when you get a massive economic crisis in December 2017, you get a contagion effect. And it's not an economic protest, it's a political protest. And this sets the trend for this movie we've been seeing since December 2017, which is fits and starts in what I call Iran's national uprising. 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, brief pause for COVID, 2022, Women Life Freedom Movement, 2025, 6, this, they call it the Lion in the Sun Revolution. Every time these protests come up, there's a greater demographic and geographic spread of them. There's a different constituency at the helm of them. They are no longer tied to an element of the state. Their slogans are increasingly more pro-Iran, more pro-nationalist. The ideology becomes 180 degrees opposite Islamist. And increasingly, there's even a willingness to push back. They tear down, in the more recent ones, statues of regime figures. And they tear down and literally have burned the regime flag. So much for the analysis of some experts after the 12-day war who said, oh, there would be a rally around the flag. 6 months later, Iranians are climbing flagpoles, burning the regime's flag and erecting the pre-1979 flag. So suffice to say, this current protest has touched all of Iran's 31 provinces, much like the Women Life Freedom protested all of Iran's 31 provinces. That one in 2022, 2023, at its peak, hit about 150 different cities, towns, and villages. This one is that plus a third or plus a half. So you could go up to 200-ish, depending on how you count some of the villages. Some would say 250, depending on how you count town versus village. But nonetheless, it's a greater, again, spread. And unfortunately, the regime sensed that this could go on longer. And once they saw real volume in the street, they brought real firepower to the street. And again, based on some reports, killed upwards of 30,000 just in a matter of 48 hours. And this 3.5-week protest was coterminous with the biggest ever internet shutdown in Iran, which was a 20-day national internet blackout. So in terms of the cost, Iranians have been trying to push past this system, again, as part of a larger story of their national uprising. And they're taking every opportunity, whether it's an economic crisis, a environmental crisis, a social crisis with the hijab in 2022, to try to push past. And that exactly gets you to why come December 25th of last year, Christmas, no nationalist Iranian was broadly seeking US or foreign military involvement. But you get past the hump of January 8, January 9, almost every nationalist Iranian to some degree is looking abroad for some measure of help.
What made it different than after Masa Amini? What's her name? Masa Amini? After she was killed, there was a huge outcry, a giant protest. What was different this time that led to such a proliferation just, outside of Tehran in all these different areas? Was it economic, or was it just like the straw that broke the camel's back?
It's actually a combination of both. Whenever these protests are economic, the contagion effect is greater and faster. 2017 was economic. 2018 was environmental and economic. 2019 was largely economic. 2022 was social. 2020 was also, there was a foreign policy one. And then again, 2025, 6 was economic. But these are the triggers. The through line through them is that people have come to the conclusion that the thesis is inherently political. It's the economic policy based on the political preferences of this unrepresentative class. So some in the West have tried to say, oh, it's an economic trigger, hence it's economic protest, hence amending economic policy placates this. No, and that fundamentally misses the political slogans. For economic protests, there aren't really any economic slogans here. And, one of the most fascinating things looking at the through line through these protests and comparing that to the way we had the conversation from the get-go, Pamela, which was the ideological background of the Islamic Republic, the history of anti-American and anti-Zionist and anti-imperial and anti-colonial ideologies, there hasn't been a single anti-American chant in any of the protests that we've seen from December 2017 to present. And I can't say, looking at the broader map of the modern Muslim Middle East today, that you could have the same phenomenon if you keep bringing out large masses of people in many of the states, including the states that we have deep political, economic, and security partnerships with. And that's why this matters for Uncle Sam. It's not just that I'm an Iranian American. And again, like I said, this is a matter of the head and the heart. This is national security 101. Iran is home to the most enduring state challenge to the US order in the Middle East today. And ironically, it has the most pro-American and even the most pro-Israeli population in the modern Middle East today. Flipping the script on the Ayatollahs, getting rid of the IRGC, that's not missionary work. That is national security strategy 101, which is why this backdrop of protests matter, which is why to get us to the current crisis, Donald Trump drew a red line, not about Iran's nuclear program, not about Iran's missile program. He drew multiple red lines in the month of January as this massive crackdown was going on because he saw the limited fits and starts of video that were coming out of Iran via Starlink, like many of us did. He saw the crackdown. He saw Iranians changing street signs to his name. He saw the graffiti asking for help. He heard the videos in English, people cursing, asking for help. This stuff has a way of moving people. And the president's red lines were, don't kill protesters, don't execute them. And worse, or more than that, he offered help and he leaned in further than any other US president leaned in for the past 47 years. And he said, help is on the way. And as the current war in the Middle East unfolds, that is a question that Iranians are asking themselves. Is this what help looks like? How long will this help go on? What about if the conflict is prematurely ended? Things of that nature.
What are they most afraid of, do you think? It's the people of Iran.
So many Iran watchers, that's the name, people in our business give themselves. So many Iran watchers suffer, and I'm not going to say I don't suffer from a selection effect. You're only as good as your sources. I do see more of a contagion, more unity in Iran towards trying to get some kind of foreign help. And now that the crisis is being paid for in terms of blood, no war is clean. No one wishes war on where they're from or where they live. But now that the investment has been made, one of the greatest fears is that Uncle Sam will stop and Donald Trump may do a 180 like he did a 180 at the end of the 12-day war, quite literally cursing out the Israelis, telling them to call back and bring back their planes. So there is that fear here that now that people are dying, now that bombs are being dropped, now that all this cost in the region too is being paid, that we would just kind of step back and replace a political win with a military win after all the damage done, after all the investment. One would think that that would have a way of forcing the mind on trying to solve the problem rather than manage the problem. And I know absolutely in terms of conventional capability, operational capability, intelligence penetration, Israel and America are leaps and bounds, as we see in this operation, as well as in the 12-day war, ahead of the Islamic Republic. That was never a question for me. The question is, how best can you use that military and intelligence advantage to get a political win? Because yes, Israel and America have proven the theory that you can have a limited war with Iran and you can come out on top. That is totally proven because for 2 decades, the regime's security strategy was limited war for me, but nothing for thee. And the regime killed us, invaded and bleeded us with proxies and partners and weapons proliferation and all the cycle of violence that all the viewers and listeners know ensconced and captured the Middle East in the post 9/11 era, particularly in the Iraq and Afghanistan era. But now that all of this is happening, it would be a shame to think that we can still manage the problem because the Israelis went through this philosophically pre and post October 7. Sometimes the more you think you're managing the problem and you delay, the more it turns out that the problem is managing you.
That's a very good way to put it. I've been seeing is a lot of course, I see the English translations online. My feed, I'm sure, is somewhat selective, but what I've been seeing is a lot of people saying that they understand that people have to die, and if they have to die, then so be it, but it's worth it. Is that a widespread feeling there that this is now existential and they need to see it through to the end, even if larger numbers of people die as a result?
Again, speaking on only based on the sources that we have, and again, the selection effect of any Iranian American trying to look back into Iran and still make contact, largely, but not exclusively, I would say yes. It's bitter. It's bitter medicine, but it's bitter medicine that forced, one of the most nationalistic populations to welcome and covet a foreign military attack on their territory. And that shows you the psychosis and even the trauma of that population. And the forcing function and the proximate cause of that trauma was the behavior of the government of the Islamic Republic itself. Again, the mass killing, 30 to 43,000 killed in 3.5 weeks, with 30,000 killed in just a matter of 48 hours, January 8, January 9. There's no coming back from that. There's no national post-divorce reconciliation between state and society after that. The state literally brought in foreign terrorist organizations, 4 Shiite militias in Iraq that Iran has armed, trained, and equipped for many years, 3 of which have American blood on their hands and are US designated foreign terrorist organizations to kill their own people. At that point, the Iranians are saying, why can't we get help from our liberal democratic partners, from people that espouse the same origins and ideology and worldview that we do. If you can have your Shiite foreign legion come and murder us, why can't we have people who claim to stand up for our values and our interests come in and try to save us? That is a risk reward calculation that many Iranians have made. I will say, however, once we get further and further down the targeting line and the war becomes, unfortunately, like many wars can become, industrialized, and there is killing, because unfortunately there is killing in every single conflict, and any casualty, any civilian is condemnable and regrettable, full stop. That is what risks pulling the plug on popular support. So it's making sure the targeting is actually going after the regime. And the Israelis have been incredibly impressive about this up until we got to this targeting of the oil installations business, because the Israelis had a division of labor with the Americans. The Americans seemed to be going after bigger military targets, missile bases, missile production facilities, while also replicating the success that the Israelis had during the 12-day war, which was to go after the launchers. The philosophy here being, if you can't defend against the arrow, or if defending against the arrow is too expensive, you target the archer. Well, now America is targeting the archer plus the building that houses the archer and the arrows at the same time. It's just more force. And this has allowed the Israelis to go after the decapitation mission, going after the political and the security elite, again, beginning with the killing of the commander in chief, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This is huge. Iranians went out into the streets dancing and felicitating and saying thank you. If you take just a random smattering of some views from people's rooftops, there's a war going on and Iranians are out filming it. There was one guy that was out there smoking hookah. There was another guy that was out there just hands behind his back washing. There was an Iranian DJ that went up there and actually started to mix tunes. And that video went viral in English language social media recently. So, Iranians are trying to prove to the world that they love life while they're surrounded by death, whether foreign or domestically imposed, all around them. Let's pray that for a swift victory. And again, speaking of the targeting, what will get to the swift victory is if the campaign moves from counter, missile and counter proliferation to counter regime. And there's a little bit of optimism here because, the Israelis have been hitting some barracks and bases and headquarters associated with the Revolutionary Guard. That's the parallel ideological military. And with the Basij, that's the paramilitary. And
Basij, by
some of
the way,
these folks,
can you just say something about the Basij? Is the Basij the group that is most responsible for targeting Iranians?
yes, it's the most, in terms of protester suppression, they are the most called upon. They are incorporated into the ground forces of the IRGC, but the reason they're the most dangerous is that they're the most ideological. They're the old volunteer army. And one reason why Iranians, again, have had to look abroad for foreign military help is that the Basij is also a check on civil society. You're in a labor union? Well, there's a labor union Basij. You're a university student? There's a university Basij. Unfortunately, this is the check, the militarized ideological check on civil society in Iran that has prevented civil society from being able to do what it has done theoretically and practically in places like Eastern Europe, for example. So this is why this group is so hated by many. And so when the Israelis target their barracks and their bases and their headquarters, these guys have moved out in tents. And the reason for cautious optimism here is that the Israelis are now strafing the tents. And this can, if it continues on a much wider scale, pave the pathway for the return of those protests. No Iranian would turn out if just a missile base was hit. But if the apparatus of repression is hit, then you have helped pave the pathway for the eventual return. You've stiffened the spine of the next round of protests, which no one is saying this thing is clean, easy, and parsimonious. But if you think that we sit back and take our hands off the wheel here, 47 years of 47 years of stasis with the Islamic Republic has not equaled 47 years of stability. So all the options ahead of us right now are messy options.
Say a little more about the terrorist organizations that have come into Iran, the proxies. What are they, and how did the Islamic Republic get to the point where it was able to fund and train and send out these proxies to be such a menace to both Israel and the US?
So this is really where statecraft and soulcraft for the Islamic Republic enter into one. And that's the export of the revolution. This is something that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is tasked with doing. Again, that's the parallel ideological military. In terms of their prerogatives, it's not a traditional military that you worry about the boundaries or the borders and you defend the state and the homeland. These guys defend the integrity and the ideology of the revolution. And much like the Soviet Revolution, it's designed to be global and perpetual, which is why for our friendly nerds on the call, the I in the IRGC is specifically Islamic. It's not Iranian. So it's designed to be transnational. The logo is transnational. It's a globe with a fist that has an AK-47 coming out of it. It's designed, it's telling you all you need to know about its revolutionary mission. And in many places, the regime, through the IRGC, worked by, with, and through grassroots, downtrodden, dispossessed populations that harbored a grievance against the state that the Islamic Republic was in tension with. And in some places, it created proxies. Places like Iraq, one of the groups that has crossed back over is the Badr Corps. Badr is not sanctioned by the US, despite Congress's best efforts to. Multiple administrations have resisted that. Or Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's another group that Iran created out of the mess of the Lebanese civil war. Or in other places where there are already terrorists and militias, through sustained political support, through widespread financial support, and most importantly, through consistent material support, Iran has been able to win some of these groups over. And that is Sunni Hamas in Gaza, or Shiite but Zaidi Houthis in Yemen. And whether they're creating or co-opting these proxies, the goal has been to control them, to control a cycle of violence, to make it such that the Islamic Republic can be strong and in power when the region looks like rubble. And many of these actors working with and through the IRGC and getting money and training and equipment have unfortunately made many of their states and their territories look like failed states and look like failed territories. And that has put the pincer both on US partners like Israel and Saudi Arabia and others in the region, as well as some struggling jurisdictions of central authority like Beirut and Baghdad, which are under pressure from a militarized militia structure from below, as well as from a political class from the side. They're able to really box in the Middle East this way. And for so many years, it was a low cost, high return on investment. It was deniable. There were attribution problems. They could work with some of these groups to do terrorist activities elsewhere. Hezbollah in Lebanon has helped Iran carry out attacks on Israelis and Jewish targets in places as diverse as Bulgaria or Argentina even. And then abroad, Iran has worked even further through local criminal networks and transnational criminal syndicates. Here in America, for instance, in the past 15 years, this arm of transnational terror didn't have the calling card of working with those proxies, but it was willing to work with Mexican drug cartels, Eastern European mafias, and even Canadian biker gangs. Tunu, Canada have biker gangs, but nonetheless, work with them to try to kidnap people, to try to terrorize people. You know full well the attempt to kill the Saudi ambassador in DC, I think 2 decades ago. You know full well the attempts multiple times to kill or kidnap Masih Alinejad, prominent Iranian American journalist who lives and works in New York City. So these are the target. They tried to kill some regime defector whose name we don't even know that allegedly lives in Maryland near the national capital area. So this is the MO of this regime. And this entire model was successful until it wasn't. And that's why I say if Ali Khamenei, can't believe I'm saying this, the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, had he died on October 6th, 2023, he would have been perhaps the most successful anti-American, anti-Israeli autocrat. And that would largely have been because of his use of this system to fight the enemy in a low-cost, unattributable way, while insulating himself and his regime and his territory from any kind of military blowback. And with the deepness of the wound, the Iran-backed wound that Hamas inflicted on Israeli society on October 7th, and Israel not necessarily having to tell the world that there's a military solution to everything, but at least being able to show the world that to military threats, there's at least military options available. This transnational terror network begun to have its wings clipped, such that the word that the regime gives for this localized terror group, they call it the axis of resistance. The MO for the axis now is they are down, but they are not out. And precisely one reason because they are down is 2.5 years of Israeli and more recently American military pressure.
You mentioned the Better Corps. Why has that not been sanctioned by the US?
There has been, fortunately, more willingness by state and treasury to go after the cutouts and the militias that the regime has had in Iraq, yeah, particularly even using the foreign terrorist organization designation. But it seems like, for a couple of iterations of administrations, Obama, Trump, Biden, and now Trump, there's been a lack of willingness to do that because since the counter ISIS campaign, they had liaised with some US forces and in particular, the U.S. may have provided even air cover to some of these Shia militias, which at that time were fighting ISIS. So there's a stickiness, there's something reputational. And the fact that, unfortunately, many of these Shia militias have parliamentary and political representation, and America, which still does engage politically, albeit not that much or no longer at that highest of levels anymore, um, has been afraid to kind of rattle. They see them as a bridge to these other folks. I think this is a falling into the same binary trap that for many years Hezbollah and Hamas have been able to get the Europeans to fall into, which is political wing, military wing. But, unfortunately, we are where we are.
You also mentioned the problem of industrializing the war. What does that look like?
Modern war is an industrial effort. It's mechanized. Much of war is won based on logistics and intelligence, not just tactics and battlefields cutting. And the battlefields themselves, as the Israelis know all too well, are often urban areas. The US saw that in Iraq, the Israelis saw that in Gaza, and you can go kind of on down the list. In Iran, for example, you have large swaths of the population that are anti-regime. The challenge is not how do you create the population or move the population into a pro-American or pro-Israeli position. You already have them. The challenge is once the bombs start falling, how do you not lose them? And that is always a challenge, particularly in Iran, but it'll always be a challenge in any society because of the phenomenon of civilian casualties. And the reason this has come to the fore is, you don't have to take it from me or FDD, but you take it from Senator Lindsey Graham, even, who had politely critiqued some of the Israeli targeting of one oil refinery and several oil depots in Tehran because of the blaze that it had set, the kind of the ball of fire, the apocalyptic imagery that it had created. And again, you don't want the Iranians to believe that they're stuck between a rock and a hard place and that foreign pressure and domestic pressure is the same. It simply isn't. But that is the fear that this imagery and the closing in of the war on just Iranian citizens who, unlike Israelis, don't have bunkers, don't have any kind of meaningful civil defense. They're left defenseless. There's no siren even. I remember once the airstrike started and this is still when there was more than just dribs and drabs of stuff coming out before the Iranians shut out the internet. Some Iranians were saying, oh, how come the Israelis didn't warn us about the first strike? This was in social media. This was in Twitter and Instagram. How come some Iranian, and I think it made its way to Telegram too. They said, how come the Israelis didn't warn us about the strike? And then they were being chastised by other Iranians saying, you moron, do you think another foreign country has to go warn you? This is something that you should be telling your own government. So even in a time of war, that kind of dark humor and sass that we've seen on Iranian social media is again manifesting itself. And when we talk about industrial war doesn't differentiate between the orientations of people. It is a mass effect. And the US and Israel certainly can bring mass to bear. But again, I would stress there's an imperative to bring precision to bear rather than mass, given that we can actually achieve a political win. There is a way to have light at the end of the tunnel. Because the worst of the worst of the worst things to do, in my view, and I don't mean to call out someone like, Tucker Carlson, but the new right in general would be to vindicate their talking point that Israel can only feel safe in the region if the whole region is made to look like chaos. In my view, that's simply not true. It is the Islamic Republic who has had a foreign and security policy for the past 2 decades designed to make the Middle East look like chaos so that it can feel safe. We shouldn't let, unfortunately, some folks without the most benign political intentions be able to get away with that switcheroo.
Speaking of which, it's obvious to many why Israel would want to engage at this level with the Islamic Republic. What's not obvious to everyone is why it's in the best interests of the US. Can you talk about the threat to the US and how is this war politically versus militarily justified?
If we're just going to start with politics, because I understand that this is less popular than even President Trump's very limited intervention against the regime's nuclear program in 2025, for example. After that war is when Iran's clerical establishment, if you care about not just America first, not just MAGA, but the president himself, like so many in the Republican Party do and have been okay with President Trump recasting the Republican Party and remaking the Republican Party in his own image, I mean, then you should care about the rest of the life of the president. This is a regime which in term one promised to kill him, which in the Biden period between the Trump administration had multiple military and political figures re-up that threat, put out videos calling for that threat, had the Biden DOJ and FBI actually indict somebody and more recently prosecute somebody for trying to carry out that threat on behalf of the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and then continue issuing fatwas against him. And then now Iran's most powerful person, the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, is reiterating threats against the life of the president. So just on the sheer politics of MAGA and America First alone, I don't think we should let a regime like the Islamic Republic get away with that. And a regime that feels undeterred to make those kinds of statements, and a regime that has felt in the past undeterred to try to implement those kinds of statements, in my view, simply should not be left standing. Then there is the strategic argument, the contagion effect of weakness, the contagion effect of pulling out too early, the contagion effect of not delivering on what you said, which is President Obama, if we remember, drew a sharp red line in Syria. He backed away from it. We can debate that, but he backed away from it. And shortly thereafter, in 2014, the Russians invaded Crimea. Fast forward to 2021, everybody saw, it was on TV, the botched way, and that's being polite, that the Americans departed Afghanistan, America's longest war. And it's a fast forward to that, to not being able to inspire confidence and failing to deter the Russians from invading Ukraine, eastern Ukraine in 2022. Weakness in the era of great power competition has a contagion effect. And there is no straight line from pulling punches against the Ayatollahs to being able to win and play to win against a much more lethal actor, one that many that even are quote unquote restraintist in the Middle East or realist in the Middle East claim to be, which is, to pivot to the region to focus on China. I do believe that China is a more urgent national security threat than the Islamic Republic of Iran, but there is no path out of the desert that leaves these guys standing, because the worst thing would be in the middle of a potential Taiwan crisis to have to go back, because that's when Tehran is doubling down, or that's when Tehran is rebuilding. And if we're going to get closer into the region, America has struggled to build a more stable pro-American order in this region for a very long time. It's seen hedging by some partners. It's had Israel alone for a while. It's had Israel plus the Abraham Accord partners for a while. It's seen major changes in the orientation and foreign policy of NATO ally Turkey for a while. There's been a lot of change politically. America needs a pillar, another pillar in the region. Israel is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that could be, again, empowering the Iranian people. If you turn off the cycle of violence in the Middle East that the Islamic Republic has created in all of those theaters, that actually gives you the space, the time, the resources, the capital to do whatever else you want to do in terms of foreign and security policy, whether that's focus on the Western Hemisphere, the Donroe Doctrine, as some are calling it now, or to pivot to Asia to focus on, potential South China Sea or, God forbid, Taiwan Strait crisis in the future. That frees up the resources. Yes, we're going through interceptors, but also hopefully we're going to get the money to support the defense industrial base to support building more of those interceptors. I think the Middle East has been the testing ground for so many of these capabilities, whether that's air or missile defense or anything else. So there's that. And then there's obviously what we began with, which is the history. So if you marry the history of the regime being able to get away with all of this, the ability to actually create the space to go focus on the other issues, and then the urgency of the political, I think you get a very strong case. And if we're going to push away from all of that and say, no, that's not good enough, you only care about security, well, here's the security case. The regime is working on extending the range of its ballistic missiles. For many years, this regime has had and been home to the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. The biggest ever single day ballistic missile operation in recorded history was from the Islamic Republic of Iran on October 1st against Israel. The biggest ballistic missile barrage against U.S. forces in recorded history was in January 2020 against U.S. bases in Iraq after the U.S. killed Soleimani.
You said the biggest single day was October 1st against Israel?
October 1st, 2024. Iran called it was 300, it was single day, 300 medium range ballistic missiles. Unprecedented. The Soviets didn't do this, not present in human history. And against the US, the biggest barrage against US forces deployed abroad from ballistic missiles specifically was January 2020. And that may change now with the way the war expands, but suffice to say, these guys have been willing to put their finger on a trigger even without having a nuclear weapon. And when you look at the countries that they have been firing at, Pakistan in January 2024, Israel in April 24, October 24, June 25, and now again, March 26, multiple times a non-nuclear armed state has been willing to fire weapons that are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead at a country that already has nuclear weapons. Talk about the risk taking this regime is engaging in. And do you think it's wise to let this kind of a regime standing or push back and we'll just kind of contain it from a distance? I don't see that. And for those who care about, immediate threats to the U.S. homeland, you know, I'm not talking about the sleeper cell issue here. We can get into that potentially later, but the regime is working on extending the range of its projectiles, of its ballistic missiles. Currently, it can reach southern and small parts of Central Europe, depending on where you fire from. But the regime also has a space program. And it's that space program that is giving the Islamic Republic the potential to go further and strike farther. And while currently North Korea does have ICBMs that can reach the US and Iran has zero, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, said that by 2035, Iran could have more ICBMs than North Korea. So we don't want to let the Islamic Republic be able to pose an imminent threat against the US homeland. The goal is to learn from the mistakes we made when trying to stop a North Korean ICBM, when trying to stop a North Korean nuclear weapon, rather than let the adversary's threat grow and grow and grow and grow and be so imminent that the risk of taking action would allow them the opportunity to slice our jugular. So for all of these reasons, this is an urgent national security challenge.
And what about the sleeper cell issue that you mentioned?
There's always, God forbid, that. There was a story, I think, yesterday, I think brought to you by ABC or AP, that talked about how there was an intercept from the US intelligence community to some of these, they believed Iran-backed organizations abroad. I think it was more, we didn't mention the jurisdiction. My guess was that it was more Western or Central Europe, but nonetheless, it's dangerous because Iran has treated many of these countries that are a little bit less secure on the homeland defense front as a playground to recruit, to do sanctions busting, to do money laundering, and to engage in acts of terror. And ultimately, when you've had a border in the past, forgive me, this should not be partisan, but a border that has been so open, a land border that has been so open, where 10 or 11 million people have been able to come across undocumented, that shouldn't be a partisan challenge. That shouldn't be a local challenge. That should be a national security priority to figure out who is inside of your country. And given the regime's ability increasingly to work through local criminal syndicates that don't look like the regime's traditional terror militias, and even the ability of the regime to get guns for hire, to simply pay to play, pay to slay, for lack of a better word, this should frighten us. So I'm deliberately sidestepping the sleeper cell issue here because the goal is not to have to get anyone to chastise any community, but to realize that the regime is willing to work with elements of the criminal underworld that don't look like it, which raises again the urgency of dealing meaningfully with that threat.
Well, we saw that with the two Russian, I guess they were Russians, who were arrested for targeting Masih Alinejad, and they have been convicted and imprisoned. This was some kind of like Russian criminal syndicate that the IRGC, I guess, worked with in order to either kidnap or murder her from New York.
Exactly. I mean, that's the reach here. And it's smaller scale, but even when you look at the stories reported out of Israel, there's this website. I'm sure it's not the same website in Israel, but if folks know what TaskRabbit is, you could pay someone to, hey, mount this TV or, hey, take this furniture up the stairs for me. Whatever Israeli version of TaskRabbit or Craigslist whatever may exist there. Iran has even used these websites. Take this backpack there, take a picture of this place, and Israelis have done it. So this is the level of the regime trying to master the kaleidoscope to find the easiest angle of entry into our societies, whether that's physical, whether that's cyberspace, whether that's terrorism, or whether that's criminal. We just have to have our guard up.
Do we know what I think we know what Israel's goal is. What is the US goal? What's the end game?
I think the president has us where he wants us. There's too much of a caricature in DC where the president is either 7D chess genius or like buffoon. I
Right?
believe the answer is much more closer to someone with a strategy. The challenge is he simply won't tell allies or adversaries that strategy. He will tip his hand simply by tweeting what he seeks or what he wants, but the pathway and some of the intentions that get him on that pathway, I think he's very keen to keep the cards close to himself. So he'll telegraph a lot on Truth Social. In fact, one Truth Social post will tell you more about U.S. Foreign policy than the entire strategic communications apparatus of the U.S. government at times, which is unfortunately a very interesting / a potential indictment of that apparatus. But don't get me started on that. But I think the president is honest when he says he's looking for a win. And I think he's honest because if you look at his track record, he hasn't put the political capital behind every single element of Iran policy. He's trying to also find the path of least resistance. If I had to guess, I think he would love a Venezuela kind of situation with Iran. He's again intonated that and even said that several times. The challenge is the empirics. Iran is not Venezuela. Yes, they are both oil-rich, anti-American authoritarian systems, but that's where the differences end. Sorry, the similarities end and the differences get magnified. State-wise, society-wise, opposition-wise, and military-wise, two fundamentally different places. And even in their low chance that you get musical chairs in Tehran, like you got in Caracas with Delcy Rodriguez, the population wouldn't go for it. If you are trying to do what your national security strategy said you're trying to do, which is to get peace, prosperity, and stability to become the MO in the Middle East, which traditionally is not the operating function of that region, then you ought to actually work by, with, and through the forces that covet stability rather than the forces that covet, create, and export instability. And trying to square peg, round hole another element of this regime to give them yet another lease on life would only have more national security drama for you, for the Israelis, for the Arabs, for everybody that's been hit by elements of this regime, as well as, of course, for the Iranian population, which has been willing more than ever to risk life and limb to get rid of this system in its entirety. And the worst thing you could do is to align Washington with Tehran against the Iranian people here. So in the absence of that, the president has told the press, my end game with Iran is to win. But I think he's seeing what element steps out first. Will state do a musical chairs? Will the military come in? Will society be able to come back? I think it's a little bit unrealistic and unfair to have to put the burden of all of this on unarmed protesters. But nonetheless, I think that with a longer view of the conflict and a longer view of the situation, that's really the only thing that will deliver for the US. Otherwise, we will keep coming back at this and it'll be less popular and it'll be less effective.
So so let's just go through what I think you sort of listed about four options of what could happen, what it could look like at the end of this, whatever we're calling it, war, incursion, military travel. I mean, whatever this is. Um,
Sojourn.
I'm in Israel. Here it's a war. It's very clear what it is here. Um, and of course, there are political questions about what it is from the US standpoint. But all of that aside, what could Iran look like? What are the actual options, just really kind of simply stated?
I think there's at least four scenarios potentially coming our way. A lot of variables can get in the way to stop them or change them, but there's four. First off, we have to say Iran has a new supreme leader, like father, like son. It is his son. But actually, in this case, not necessarily like father, like son, because he's younger, he's more hardline, he's more aggressive. And we don't even know if he's actually alive at the moment. There's a lot of rumors that say he's injured. the regime could be playing some hidden mom game and say, oh, we have a leader, but he's hidden somewhere from you. So that's entirely possible.
Before you move
But
forward, say something about this this ceremony with a cardboard cutout of what was that?
I think that it turned out that that was AI, because in 2012 the regime did an actual cardboard cutout ceremony of the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, coming down an Air France flight. Um, uh, but for this one, a lot of people have been pushing back online saying that that was AI. I'm inclined to believe that. But moral of the story is that audio, video, picture, personality, none of it of Mujtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, none has been seen. And obviously that raises major questions, because this is a regime that is too afraid to bury the father. They are afraid of getting all the politicians and religious folks in one area to go and bury the father, both for fear of mass protest contagion effect against these guys, as well as America or Israel potentially strafing the funeral and taking out the next generation, political class, military class, religious class, what have you.
Given that the
So
regime leadership has made the mistake of meeting in person twice in a row and being taken out.
above ground, exactly.
That's right.
So that's the challenge, is that this guy is in charge, but is he really in charge? Is he really alive? So if the president declares victory early, model number one is, God forbid, North Korea, which means that if the president achieves his limited military aims, feels good enough about it, pushes away from the table, and doesn't invest in a more aggressive containment and rollback policy against Iran, says, hey, I defang them, push away from the table, go to the next challenge. It means that that which remains in Iran, the Islamic Republic, as well as allegedly the son of Khamenei, Mr. Mojtaba Khamenei, if he remains, that means that you're going to be headed towards a more isolated, a more militarized, a more paranoid national security deep state that is intent on revenge and rebuilding, and will require you to come back, or will simply outlast you. Or at that point, as its missile capability goes down, as its terrorism capability goes down, the imperative for it to go nuclear will go up. So be wary of that trade-off. The second option might sound attractive to some folks. I think Walter Russell Mead called this Venezuela minus. I call it Burma/Myanmar. It's basically stylistic change to give President Trump a political win, but no substantive change. So in the sense that this new supreme leader or what's left of the national security deep state feels so boxed in, and President Trump indeed does get his military victory, and that these guys in Tehran are so, Bismarckian about their survival, they will put someone up stylistically to give the illusion of change to President Trump without any of the substance of change, to get him to lean into the diplomatic win that he could have. And the reason I call it the Burma/Myanmar model is because that's exactly what the junta in that country did with Aung San Suu Kyi. You take a political prisoner out, you take someone who the West knows, you rotate the political elite at the top. And while the West and the NGO community are busy looking at that, the guys with the guns turn their guns inwards, regroup, rebuild, and at their own time dispense with that political figurehead and go back to their agenda just as, business as normal. And here the goal would be, give America some sort of a fig leaf, some sort of a semblance of a win, just with a stylistic political change at the top, a change in, again, tone, style, rather than substance. The goal being to wait for Bibi and wait for Trump to leave office, and then you can regroup. So that's option two headed off. Option three, I think, is longer, but is really the only one. And I call it the Iran model. Iran as in generate the mass volume of protests that you need. Why did Iran, after the 12-day war, why did Iran jail 21,000 people right after the 12-day war? Some of which just for an innocent thing as liking a pro-Israel post on Facebook or social media. Because they fear the contagion effect. So I say, give them the contagion effect. They saw the foreign loss in the 12-day war. They couldn't win abroad. And so to prevent a contagion effect of domestic dissidents building onto the loss at the hand of a foreign power, they cut that cord and they just started mass arrests, securitized the situation like we talked about before. Fast forward to January 2026, in an era when exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is calling for mass protests and can generate real volume of protesters in Iran, in an era when President Donald Trump is talking about helping on the way or make Iran great again, and the regime sees real volume. According to European diplomats, over 1.5 million in Tehran. According to local sources in other major urban centers, Mashhad is Iran's second biggest city, at least 500,000. Again, all kind of guesstimates. When you add all of this stuff up, the regime sees the volume and again says, it's the reverse this time. They saw mass domestic protests and they said, well, they will be foreign contagion effect. The West will come in right after. And I think that's one reason why the regime killed so many January 8, January 9. So if the goal is the regime fears foreign military pressure and domestic street pressure, then what you should do is entrap them exactly in this. And the way you do that is you succeed in the military mission, you continue the targeting that America and Israel have, but then you move towards counter-regime targeting and you make it a campaign rather than an operation. So you extend the timeline of this thing and you do away with the B-2s, you do away with the F-35s, and you bring in tons and tons of drones and tons of low and slow flying aircraft, as well as aircraft that can provide close air support. And you basically incentivize the population by working with the opposition to turn out in certain places. And if the security forces turn out, that's when you level the playing field for the population. Think about it as a Trumpian R2P kind of model. If this works, this would be a game changer. But this is option 3. I call it revolution. Option 4 is the worst of all. I call it devolution. And that is the Middle East can always get worse, not better. We've seen that firsthand for the past few decades. And this could happen if so much of the state institutions are forced to be burned through. Again, one of the good things about the Iranian opposition today versus the Iraqi opposition way back pre-Saddam was that the Iranians are trying to keep as much of the state as possible while also trying to fight as much of the regime as possible. So this is not about de-Baathification or gutting everything else. But the longer a war can go on, the more you actually would risk losing, unfortunately, some of those state elements and state institutions. So the fear of a failed state growing is real, as well as potentially if America doesn't sense the win or Israel doesn't sense the win and doesn't want to invest political capital and time and everything else into the revolution model, it might try to stoke ethno-sectarian insurgency in some places just to pin down elements of Iran's security forces. There was a whole host of reporting about a little less than a week ago about potentially arming the Kurds. Again, past this prologue, all that's going to really lead to, aka what happened with Syria, is a lot of betrayal and dead Kurds. But in this case, you'll have a lot of bad blood with the great amount of nationalists protesting Iranians. So here too, the potential could be failed state or civil war. So we have to be very careful here. There are a lot of things coming our way. We are now in the cycle. There's a whole host of bad options. America has to be able to align ways, means, and ends to get the least bad option. I don't think we can be indifferent to any of these options. And I hope it's clear that I only recommend option 3.
Yeah, that's the revolution model. But the one thing we haven't talked about is the role of Reza Pahlavi. Is his involvement a real possibility, or is it more sort of something that maybe those outside of Iran hope for?
You know, the funny thing is, I think he's more popular inside Iran because the Iranian diaspora is cut from the cloth of the generations of people that have left that country. But it's been, again, when it comes to the selection effect, a real social change in that country. And just like we saw with the change in protest, 2009, 1999, Iranians trying to reform the system, 2017 to present, Iranians at all costs trying to push past the system. At that time, the more the state failed and the more the state doubled down on Islamism, the more the population looked for something to graft onto that was 180 degrees opposite Islamism. And as you know, that is nationalism. And that correlates very strongly with the ideology that the exiled crown prince has been pushing. And unlike nationalism in a lot of places like Russia, where it's revisionist and revanchist and grievance driven, in the protest slogans themselves, even the ones from 2009, the nationalism of Iranian protesters is actually kind of a positive civic nationalism. And the foreign policy effect of that is not the caricature that we have of Iranian hegemony or empire building or pet predation or irredentism or imperialism, but actually it is Iran come home, Iran first. It's actually to extricate Iran from this web. You know what Pericles in the Peloponnesian War called the empires as pesky things. You know, enough with these pesky things. Time to quote unquote make Iran great again. Uh, and that resonance plus the imagery. You know, nostalgia is something very interesting when you don't even live through it. So much of Iranians, younger Iranians, haven't lived through the Iran-Iraq War, let alone, the revolution, let alone seen the Pahlavi era, where admittedly there wasn't political freedom, but there was social freedom and there was economic freedom. And now they've lost economic freedom and social freedom and never even meaningfully achieved any political freedom. So certainly there is a nostalgia, but it's a nostalgia that is able to be grafted onto the future and contrast very sharply with the present. Any Iranian will tell you the real hell it is to be able to go to Western Europe or Central or any EU country or go to the West or go to America or Canada on an Iranian passport. My father always tells me, conversely, who was out of Iran for 10 years before the revolution, that he could cross the Italian Swiss border easier just by flashing his Iranian passport than his Italian friends could. They would have to get out of the car and go into the little vestibule, and he could just hold up the passport. Imagine that the Iranian passport got you further than the Italian passport. Um, Fast forward to, the currency crisis. We talked about the exchange rate here in December 2025 being one of the forcing functions for the crisis. At the time of the revolution, it was anywhere from 70 to 75 reals. Today, it's 1.6 million reals. Now, this is a system brought to you by people who literally said economics is for donkeys, or that the revolution wasn't about the price of watermelon. This is exactly what you get. So to correlate all of that back with the exiled crown prince, there is more kind of dissent in my view and dissonance about him and his role in the diaspora, because the diaspora has the multiple generations of folks who have left Iran, particularly from the revolutionary era, as well as when the left was being purged very strongly in that country, that carries with it that 1979 animosity. But for so many inside Iran, protest activity, social movements are a referendum on 1979. And one comparative advantage that weirdly President Trump seems to use as a criticism is that Reza Pahlavi is not in Iran, is that he is not tainted by the politics of accommodation, of reform, of Islamism, is that he has been able to hold his ground of secular government, nationalism, and representative government. And yes, he was more quieter and less effective in the 80s and 90s because the voices of moderation were quieter. And I don't think we need to say that anybody who is chanting his name is inherently a monarchist. I think they simply see him as a bridge to a post Islamic Republic in Iran. And I think it really would behoove not just America, but the West to get behind that, because I don't know any other name that is being chanted under the cost of bullets. And if you want a better death knell in this regime, I can give you no better image than from mid-January this year in the small town of Khomeini, which is in central Iran, which is the birthplace of Ayatollah Khomeini. Again, that same kind of pioneer of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In the birthplace was the chant, Javid Shah, or Long Live the King. This has come full circle.
Thank you very much. This is a great conversation and very thorough. Is there anything that we left out? Any last words that you want to share?
No, I think it was pretty comprehensive. It's always a pleasure to see you and speak with you. Thank you for your time, Pamela.
Thank you.